This is Jose coming to you from Sinister Spotlight here at Mephisto's Castle. For today's episode, I'm very pleased and honored to have Mr. Jack Veasey here. Some of you might know him as the writer from Lavender Lair of Horror, which is a fantastic blog and oftentimes is very, very funny. So, of course, I recommend you go there any chance you get. And for today's episode, we are going to be talking about Night of the Demon from 1957, and by the time that this episode airs on the website, it will actually be a pretty appropriate time because, if my understanding is correct, it will be December, which is, as you'll hear probably later on, again, a very fitting month when we're talking about a story and a film inspired by M.R. James, who was, of course, very famous for his Christmas ghost stories. So, Jack, I'm very happy to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, to kind of get us started off, since this is Jack's pick, I wanted to ask you, just for the benefit of those listening, could you give us a rundown of the film's plot so we kind of have a grasp on what the story is here and all of its arcane happenings?
Okay. Well, it concerns a scientist who is investigating paranormal phenomena, and he's one of his agendas is that he wants to expose a particular satanic cult in England, and the man who runs this cult is named Carswell,
Mm-hmm.
and he wants to expose this man as a fraud and as someone who is bilking his followers out of money. And they're having a symposium, a national symposium of scientists who are all going to be discussing the occult and paranormal phenomena. And most of them are a bit skeptical, but the guy who's our main character, who's played by Dana Andrews, is beyond skeptical. He's completely closed to the whole idea of the supernatural. And when he shows up, one of his colleagues has recently died. He was electrocuted when power lines fell in his car. And the person that he's investigating, the person who's the leader of this cult, a man named Carswell, had encountered this guy and passed him a piece of paper with runic inscriptions on it. And his niece comes and talks to the Dana Andrews character and is concerned for his well-being. She thinks that Carswell is also going to do the same type of thing to him. And in fact, he does run into Carswell at the British Museum, and Carswell does pass him a piece of paper, and then he begins to have these experiences, which he considers hallucinations at first. He begins to feel disoriented and have strange sensations, and then he starts actually seeing things. He's in the woods at one point, and he sees this sort of ball of fire come toward him, and hears this weird chittering sound, and it gets more and more menacing, but he continually refuses to believe that there's anything real going on. He thinks that it's all just some sort of a prank. And of course, we find out that it's not, and he eventually is being pursued by this demon, which we see in the film. That's one of the points I want to discuss, because the director of the film, Jacques Tourneur, who also directed Cat People
Right.
and a number of other Val Lewton films, didn't want to show the demon in the film, and footage was inserted after he'd completed the film of the demon, and he felt it really cheapened the film. However, I think the footage that was inserted is really effective.
Yeah.
And the demon is one of the scariest monsters from any film of the 50s. So that basically is the plot of the film. I don't want to reveal too much, although I would imagine that anybody who sees it at this point probably knows a lot about it already before they even see it.
Right. Well, it still remains somewhat of, it's gained a more of a following, I think, in recent years, whereas it tends to kind of go unnoticed, in a point that we'll bring up in a bit here. I think one reason being is that it's one of the few truly supernatural horror films to come out of the 50s that, dealt with black magic and demons and things like that. In the 50s, you typically had, these radiation-soaked insects that grew to these gigantic proportions and alien invaders, and those were kind of more of sci-fi tinged horror movies, and this was really a rarity in the decade, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 50s, everybody was very preoccupied with science. And I think a lot of people were paranoid about the advances in technology. And of course, with the Cold War going on, people were very afraid of the atomic bomb. And so, of course, these movies where the monsters were mutations were very much a popular thing then. They really struck a chord with the average person.
Yeah.
But this movie is kind of the opposite. The fear isn't coming from science. The fear is to do with science. It's fear of superstition. And science is trying to displace religion as being the main belief system, the main thing that people believe in.
Yeah, that's very true. And, in a lot of ways, the science world in this movie, and you kind of get this impression as well in the other 50s horror movies that deal with, radioactive monsters and aliens. The science almost becomes, it's not a very passive group of people. They're very, they're not exactly antagonistic, but, Dana Andrews, for instance, has to be one of the most unbearably snooty, close-minded characters that you're probably likely to see in any movie of any genre. And usually films from the 50s that dealt with, science was usually the prevailing force. That was what was going to, kill the aliens and the monsters, and even though usually they were at fault, they would still usually win out at the end of the day. But here, it's like you say, it's just a war between, religion and science, to the point that science almost seems unnecessary in this movie. There's no explaining what happens, and you can't even really say that science wins at the end of the day. And Night of the Demon, of course, I'm not trying to give anything away here, but it's not like they come up with this solution on the fly, like a giant demon swatter or something like that to dispel the dark forces. No, at the end of the day, everything is pretty much left unanswered, which is, more unsettling, of course, than having all the aliens die off and whatnot.
Yeah. I think really the conflict is a conflict of belief, and I think that the main character, Dana Andrews' character, is named Dr. Holden, and he's really arrogant. And when the niece of one of the earlier victims comes and tries to help him, Joanna Harrington, who ends up being his love interest, of course, very much in the spirit of the 50s. He keeps flirting with her. He doesn't take anything she says seriously, and she's obviously, A, she just lost her uncle, who she loved, and this is important to her, and B, she's trying to save his life, and it's not taking him seriously at all.
No.
For some reason, she persists and is attracted to him, but I think if I were her and he received me the way he initially receives her, I'd just leave him and go on with my life.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, oh my God. Andrews is like a lost cause in this movie. Even when it comes down to the 11th hour, you can obviously see he's trying to fight for his own life, but even as he's trying to reverse this spell, so to speak, that's been cast upon him, even then you still get the feeling that he's saying in his head, I'm so not buying this, I'm just doing this because it's the only thing that I know to do at this point. Everything else hasn't worked, but even though everything has led me, has shown me that this is the only possible answer, I'm still not biting. And it just drives you crazy because there's not even, he's worse in some ways than some of the teenagers you find in slasher movies. He is that thick-headed.
Yeah.
It's really hard to deal with him.
He just doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Although, to save himself, he eventually has to open his mind somewhat. And
Right.
at that point, he's too afraid to not consider that possibility.
Yeah.
And he certainly doesn't try to save himself by using science.
Oh, no. Yeah. That's exactly it. But I wanted to backtrack just a little bit here, and I wanted to ask you just how exactly did you come into contact with Night of the Demon? If I'm not mistaken, you told me that you're actually more accustomed to seeing the Curse of the Demon version of this film, which we'll go into a little detail here in a bit. But yeah, what was your first experience with this film like, and was your reaction to it at first the same one that you have now when you watch the movie?
Well, it scared me.
Yeah, it scared me, and I just watched it.
I was a young kid, and it was probably the early '60s when I saw it. And I saw it on UHF television on Saturday night. They showed horror movies, and I was just riveted by them. It was mostly old Universal films, and a lot of them I would get really excited while watching them, but they didn't usually actually scare me because I liked werewolves and Frankenstein's monster and whatnot, and I got a big charge out of it rather than being frightened by it. This movie actually scared me. The scenes where the demon was materialized and coming into our dimension, coming after him, I was just mesmerized by them. And the first appeal that it had for me was that it scared me so potently. And that really made me always remember it. And of course, the version of it was Curse of the Demon, which is the American release. They cut out, I think, about 15 minutes of the film.
Yeah, it was a good chunk.
And when you see the whole thing, it's not all that different because many of the things they cut out were very brief. But there is one substantial scene in it that was not in the version I saw at first. And I actually think it works better without that scene.
Oh, which scene was that?
Well, there's a scene where Dr. Holton goes to visit some of Carswell's followers who are dirt poor farm people who live out in the middle of nowhere, and they live in this farmhouse completely surrounded by weeds and looks really run down.
Yeah.
And they're kind of scary people. They're hostile. They don't say very much. And he comes and sits in the midst of a group of them, and he's trying to find out some detail about a fellow named Hobart. The family's name that he's visiting is Hobart. And Hobart was a man interviewed at the symposium. They hypnotized him. And he goes to see them to get permission to do this procedure, to hypnotize Hobart and try to find out what happened. Hobart is another person who witnessed this demon phenomenon. And he gets their permission because, as far as they're concerned, Hobart is dead today. He's no longer a member of their cult. He's betrayed them. But the thing that doesn't make any sense about it is that these people are really poor. And Carswell, the head of the cult, has this huge estate, which he says in the film at one point when he's talking to his mother, that his followers pay for him to live in this style. And when Dr. Holden goes to visit him and sees the man, he exclaims, "Wow, I'd really like to know who Carswell's racket is." But then you see these people, and they're just so poor, and there's only a handful of them. And it just doesn't make any sense. They're supporting Carswell in grand style. There'd have to be thousands of people this poor following for him to have amassed that much money.
Right.
For him to depend on them for that much wealth and influence. He'd have to be like the equivalent of Pat Robertson or something like that.
Right.
A modern figure somebody from our own time, a televangelist, could get that much money out of lots and lots and lots of poor people. But we don't get that impression. We get the impression that his followers are just this handful of very poor people out instead. So in that sense, it's an effective scene because the people are scary, and it's an eerie scene. But when you think about it, it makes the film make less sense. It's better if you don't know anything about his followers.
Right. See, I remember you mentioning that before, and I started thinking about it. Now, I could be totally off base here with my thoughts, but it occurred to me, do you think that it might be possible that the the Hobart family and however many other followers that Carswell have, I started thinking, what if they're actually really prosperous, like farmers, and they do make a lot of money, but when Andrews, Dr. Holden, goes to their estate, he's basically seeing what's become of them. At once, they were, maybe they had a thriving plantation. Well, that's a southern thing, but, in terms of, British Isles, they had a really thriving farmland, and Holden is just seeing what's become of it. Them paying Carswell all this money has made their estate deteriorate into the condition that it is. That's something that occurred to me. I'm not sure if that makes any sense whatsoever, but I wanted to know maybe if you think that could have been possible, and maybe in that light it makes a little more sense.
Well, I think it could be possible, but I think that the movie is kind of throwing you a curveball by showing this.
Yeah.
And not only that, why would they continue to follow him and to be so loyal to him if he was bleeding them dry? I mean, one of the things supposedly about people getting into black magic is that what makes it worth it is that there's a payoff. They get into it in order to gain magical knowledge and be able to manipulate their material circumstances. Lots and lots of times when you hear about Satanists, you hear these myths of, oh yeah, well, they sold their soul, but they got all this stuff in return. And at the end of their lives, they have to pay when they finally die and end up going to hell. But here in this life, there's a big payoff. And that's usually the way it's presented if you read, say, Dennis Whedon novels, like The Devil Rides Out or books like that. Generally, all the followers are really wealthy. And if there's any kind of gathering of, it's like this chic gathering of people and they're all doctors and whatnot. It doesn't fit in with the conventions of this type of story. To have them really poor.
Right.
And while you're thinking about it, meanwhile, and considering, well, maybe it's this other possibility, you're distracted from being caught up in the story.
That's true. Well,
so I just think the scene detracts from the movement of the story. It's a distraction.
Right. No, you bring up an excellent counterpoint, I think. My personal thought was more of an afterthought after I had been thinking about it. It wasn't so much during the actual film. And like you say, it's a very effective scene. It's a very eerie scene. It builds up that suspense and foreboding, especially when the slip containing the runes flutters out of Holden's pocket, and the Hobart family sees it, and they just recoil from in that horror movie drastic way, which is a convention that I love personally. But it's too bad almost that they couldn't have with a little reworking, maybe making it so that they are a wealthy family. I really don't know. I can't think of anything in the story that would have to be drastically altered if, say, the Hobart family was this prosperous family of, devil worshippers, so to speak. So, yeah, maybe if it was just a simple change so much as that, it would have been, an effective scene plus a logical scene.
Well, they seem to give you the impression that people follow Carswell because they're afraid of him.
Yeah, that too.
Rather than because they're getting anything out of it. and that may make sense too. But it's just when you see the estate that he lives in, and I mean, it's just such an incredible state of luxury. All his property and rambling grounds and everything.
It's a bitchin' house.
Yeah, it just makes you think that money's got to be coming from somewhere, you know, and a handful of poor farmers couldn't supply that much money.
Well, who knows? Maybe, you know, Carswell invested in something.
Yeah, right.
But, yeah, something else along those same lines. We're talking about the two different cuts of the film here, Curse of the Demon and Night of the Demon. I also wanted to make it apparent to viewers who may not know, not only is there about 15 minutes worth of footage taken from Night of the Demon that isn't in Curse of the Demon, but I was surprised to find out, and I tried watching Curse of the Demon, and surprisingly, I didn't pick up on it as far into it as I got to, but I learned out afterwards that there's a number of scenes from Night of the Demon that are shuffled around in order, and they're kind of rearranged in Curse of the Demon. So you have seen Night of the Demon, correct?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a stupid question. But yeah, so in that case, I wanted to ask you, do you personally pick up on any difference for the better or the worse in the shuffling of the scenes? Like, do you prefer how the events are presented in Curse of the Demon, or do you tend to...
I do.
Really? Okay.
I do, yeah. Particularly the one scene where he's looking down the hallway and his vision wanders. That's in the film earlier.
Yeah,
and it
that's right.
creates sense of loading earlier, which gets us interested and holds our interest.
Right.
And so I think it's actually effective having it there than where they originally had it.
Yeah, because in Night of the Demon, I think that scene was pretty much right directly in the middle of the movie, which, you know, is some... I guess it's kind of odd, because when you watch it in Night of the Demon, it almost kind of happens out of nowhere, dare I say. I'm not sure if that's quite the best way to phrase it, but like you say, it works a little bit better, I would think, if it happens earlier in the film, because, you know, not only do we get the fantastic opener that we do when you know, the first scientist is murdered. That's so awesome introduction to the story. But then it's like right when Holden arrives on the scene, you know, he's starting to hear that chitter, and we all know what it is. So I think you're right in saying that presenting that scene not so shortly after the wonderful the wonderful murder scene that we get right at the beginning definitely builds up suspense and then keeps the viewer's interest in the film for sure.
Yeah, it's a very involving scene, because we need to start seeing from Holden's viewpoint early on,
right? And
to see the effect that it's having on, you know, and that way they grab us and begin to watch the process of his, let's call it the deterioration of his confidence.
Yeah, as slow going as it may be, that's the start of it, at least. But yeah, you also mentioned as well, and fans of classic horror, I'm sure, have probably picked up on this fact already, especially since Jack mentioned it directly, that Jacques Tourneur, who directed this movie, also directed Cat People, and as far as I know, might have been involved with a few more of the Val Lewton films. And
he directed I Walk with a Zombie.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that is correct. So you can, I think, especially for those, obviously, who are familiar with, you know, those RKO pictures from the 40s, you can definitely pick up, even if this film, Night of the Demon, is a good decade later, 1957, you can still pick up on some of those visual cues and just the moodiness that Tourneur invokes in the film. There's that, you know, the fear of the unknown, basically, and, you know, there are shadows. It's basically a film noir with horror trappings. We have, you know, the dark shadows and the looking over the shoulder, and you're always unsure if there's any real supernatural activity occurring. I mean, in Cat People, it's much, much more subdued, even more than Night of the Demon, because we see the monster itself face, head on. But you can still pick up on those things, I think, in this movie.
Yeah, in Cat People, often the action is frightening takes place largely in shadow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And you're really not sure whether there's what appears to be going on is happening or not, or if it's just happening in the minds of the characters. And in Curse the Demon, it's a lot clearer, but it's clearer because of footage that was inserted after Tourneur was done doing his job.
Right.
But it's still very effective. Right, those scenes with the demon are just really unnerving. It's just a puppet effect, but I still think it's one of the scariest movie monsters I've ever seen.
For sure. It
has a lot of character, that face.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's
face coming
yeah, it's it really is chilling, it's I like you say, it's just, the mechanics that you see involved with the face when it's looking directly at the camera, especially just all the weird twisting and contorting that, it does when it bares its fangs and flares its nostrils, and its eyes. It's really unnerving, and you think, a part of you, that cynical little Jiminy Cricket that always kind of sits on their shoulder, he's telling you that, well, it's a dummy, of course. It's just a little doll that's probably no bigger than, the size of your arm. But still, when you see it, it invokes, that terrified feeling in you, especially when it's accompanied by that horrendous chittering sound that it makes.
Yeah. And the smoke and the flame and everything.
Oh, yeah.
It looks like I think one of the things that's so effective is it looks like it's coming into this world from another world.
Yeah.
It looks like it's coming out of another dimension. The whole way that it materializes gradually out of this light and smoke and fire and noise. And it's also interesting the way they play with the size of it in the film.
Yeah.
Because you don't know how big it is in relation to other things when you see it coming toward you. You're already scared.
Yeah.
But then every now and then they'll give you a look at how big it is. Like in the first scene where it kills Dr. Harrington.
Yeah, and you see the claw
towering over his car.
Yeah.
There are power lines that come down, and the reason they come down is because this creature walked into them and banged them with its head. I mean, it's this gigantic creature. And that is one of the things that makes it so weird. It seems like it's changing size every time you see it. First it's small and then it's becoming larger.
Yeah.
And there's just something about the fluidity of it. The fact that it's becoming what it is. It's becoming more and more what it is as it gets closer to you.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they figured that out, but that's a really effective way of presenting it.
For sure. Yeah, like
it's haunted me all this time, since I first saw it.
I can imagine. This definitely seems like a childhood trauma for sure.
Yeah.
But like you say, it's never even explicitly stated that this creature is coming from the Christian version of hell. Because he just materializes, or it materializes out of, thin air, basically. The smoke comes up and billows, and it's this wonderful effect, and it almost reaches the point of being, Lovecraftian, almost. It's who knows, it could very well be one of the great old ones. It's never, called by name or anything like that, but it's... Even the unknown is unknown. We don't know where this thing comes from, or who its master is, or who it is even. It's just unnerving that, the only thing that you do know is what it looks like, and it looks freaking horrifying.
Yeah. It's also, there's something really unnerving about how impersonal it all is, too. It's coming after whoever has this piece of paper.
Yeah,
it
that's
doesn't
it.
care. It doesn't care who you are. It just senses that you've got this piece of material on you that it's attracted to.
Yeah, it's like the devil bat almost.
Yeah, right. The lotion in
that
Lugosi film. Yeah. and that's really scary too. And the idea that this piece of paper can be just as easily transferred to another person.
Yeah.
And if the person gives it to someone else and they don't realize they have it, then they become the one in the danger. And somehow that's a really spooky idea.
Right. Yeah, because it's it's not like Pumpkinhead, for instance.
No,
It's acting out of vengeance, or
yeah,
it's not geared towards a purpose. It's not even a Terminator, and that's a machine. It
right.
was kind of hoping that maybe Holden would prove his real, show his true colors by slipping the piece of paper to maybe one of those kids at the party. That would have been an interesting scene to see unfold.
Well,
That
it's interesting. I think that the image of the demon, really comes from the M.R. James story, even though we never really see it.
hmm
Um, the character Carswell, the leader of the cult, is based on Aleister Crowley.
Right,
And
yeah.
Aleister Crowley was a very well-known occultist in England. He lived in the late 1800s, and I think he died in 1947.
hmm
But he was quite a character in England. He got a lot of press in the tabloids in England, and he was not a Satanist, and he didn't consider what he did evil.
Right.
But he was considered to be a very menacing figure, and he would dress in black, and he called himself the Great Beast, which of course everybody identifies with the end of the world in the Book of Revelations, as if he was the Antichrist.
hmm
And he did this stuff to get publicity. He did this stuff to attract attention and notoriety. But there was a point where this character Carswell, Crowley would often do things to shock people, and the character Carswell in the story wants to provide entertainment for the local school children at one point, and brings in this magic lantern show. He volunteers to do it, and they allow him to do it. And in the magic lantern show, it shows this creature dodging about among the trees. And there's some kind of an effect that he does with it by prestidigitation. He's also something of a magician. In the theatrical sense,
Uh-huh.
as he is in the movie. I mean, in the movie, he's pulling puppies out of hats,
Which is adorable.
The first time we see him, but this original Carswell, James's Carswell, didn't delight children. He enjoyed scaring children. He really disliked children.
Sounds like my kind of guy.
And they describe this creature as this white-robed thing hopping back and forth among the trees, and it eventually seems like it's coming out of the screen. And I think just that brief description in the story is probably where they got the idea for how they presented the whole thing visually in the film.
Yeah,
You know,
and that's such a a goose pimple inducing cryptic line.
yeah.
It's in the trees. It's in the trees. It's
yeah.
It's so unnerving. But that description alone, I haven't read the James story myself, Casting the Runes, for those interested, and so I haven't had the benefit of getting those shocks. But just that description alone of it seems purposefully elusive in its description. It's just a white thing hopping about the trees. It could be anything, when you think about it. And of course, that type of, mindset, I think, is much more scarier than, detailing exactly what this thing looks like. Oh, it's 18 feet high and it's got 2 horns. And, when you just describe it as, this thing that's running through the trees, of course, the reader's mind and the viewer's mind, if they can't see it, just runs rampant. And they start thinking of all these horrible and terrifying things that, to them personally, scare the wits out of them.
Well, it's more effective to let the reader's imagination supply the details.
Oh yeah, and you hear that a lot, and it's almost to the. I think that people take that for granted. They think it's a cliche. Oh, what you don't see is scarier than what you do see. But I think people say it for a reason. I think it's absolutely true. Because you can hear something like that, a white thing hopping about the trees, and you have no idea what it is. You fill in the blanks, and you color it the way you want, and add every gruesome, horrible detail, which in your mind looks fabulous, but once you start describing the horror, I think it takes a little bit away from it.
Well, James's story never really confronts us with the demon itself, and all of the violence that happens in the James story happens off stage.
Yeah.
We basically hear news of it later. It's reported by other characters, or there's an item in the newspaper talking about it. And so in that sense, it's almost like James even takes that principle of subtlety further than Jacques Tourneur would have liked to.
Yeah.
Tourneur really didn't want to show us the demon either, but James never shows it to us at all.
Yeah. Yeah, not even a puff of smoke like Tourneur would have had in his version of the film.
The only thing in the James story, the only things that the movie really uses, literally, the thing in the British Museum is in the story, where he runs into Carwell in the British Museum and Carwell slips him the paper. And then, ultimately, the thing in the train, where he gives the runes back to Carwell, that's in the story, too. And that's the last time we see Carwell, although we hear about what happens to him later.
Right. Yeah. What does happen to him, by the way? Have you read the story recently?
Yeah. A stone falls off of a scaffolding in an old church that he's visiting and hits him in the head, supposedly.
Right. It's kind of, well, when you compare that to the film, at least it seems a little bit anticlimactic.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely what happens to him in film is a lot worse.
Oh, yeah. It's, he got off easy in the story, it seems like, for sure. Yeah. And, yeah, just talking about, the violence happening off scene, I think, that last scene, which I know we kind of said that we wouldn't spoil anything here, but it's kind of hard not to talk about it just because it's so great. That last scene, even though, of course, it's a 1957 movie, we don't see, viscera or, any type of gore, really. I think it's pretty rough what we do see happen to Carwell because, the demon materializes as it does, and it chases Carwell down the train tracks, and we get kind of a far-away shot of the demon as opposed to, seeing its claw or its twisted face. We get kind of a, far-away shot, which really puts into perspective how big this thing is supposed to be in relation to our world. And it's to be perfectly frank about it, it's a guy in a suit, but it's really vicious because you see him holding, Carwell, and the creature is just like ripping into it, and he actually takes it, into its two hands and just slams it down onto the ground. It's just really heavy stuff to see.
Yeah. Carwell just looks like a doll.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's just when you imagine that happening to an actual human body, it's it's pretty heavy stuff, for sure. And that shot alone, I think, even if it is essentially the same thing that Godzilla was, I think that shot of the creature is just as unnerving as the close-up of its face that we see when you see all the little twitches and contortions that it does. It chilled me seeing it because its eyes are glowing in the night, and it's just tearing into this poor guy who, he's a villain, but at this point I think everybody's sympathizing with him.
Well, he's a villain, but he's also one of the more likable characters in the film. He's really smart, he's clever, he's funny. And whenever he comes up against Dr. Holden, whenever they actually have a conversation, he steals the scene.
Yeah, for sure.
Because he's charming and he's funny, and Holden is just this stuffed shirt.
Oh, God, yeah. And, you have Dana Andrews and the part that he is in this movie. I think everybody looks a little bit cheerier when they're with him. But, no, I think McGinnis, the actor who plays Carwell, I love him. Yeah, Niles McGinnis.
He's great.
Yeah,
he steals every scene he's in.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's not to the point that, I don't think anyway, that he's chewing on the scenery. He's very subdued. When he's playing, coolly evil, he's very subdued. But there are other dynamics that are involved with his character that I really enjoy. And one of them, you see it the most right at the end before the horrible uh, demon occurrence that we just discussed. You see him get genuinely petrified of because he's on to Holden and he knows he's trying to slip him the runes. So you see McGinnis like he's just as afraid of the demon as anybody because he knows that nothing can control it, and he just turns into like this sniveling little whelp, and it's realistic, I think, and I think it creates a nice dimension to him. Whereas in some movies, the villains are just always so cool and so calm, but no, this guy's scared out of his freaking mind because he knows what's gonna happen to him if he gets those runes back.
And you do feel for him.
Yeah, on some
that's
level.
one of the reasons why the scene is so scary.
Yeah,
because you know that this likable, charming guy is about to get eviscerated, and you wouldn't care if you didn't like him.
No, of course not. And I mean, come on, we see the guy handing out puppies to a bunch of kids. How can you not like him a little bit? And he's dressed as this jolly-looking clown. It's pretty hard not to like Carswell for all of his, black magic hijinks and control over his subjects. He's a cool guy. I wouldn't mind hanging out with him.
His relationship with his mother makes him sympathetic.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, for sure.
Earlier in the movie, his mother gets a seance together to try to warn Dr. Holden. She wants to get him to reverse the curse somehow. And she starts talking to him to try to talk him out of hurting Dr. Holden,
Yeah.
And he says that once it's been set in motion, you can't do anything about it, really. But he indulges his mother, and even though she's working at purposes that are different than his, he accepts that. And his mom is this very eccentric, flamboyant kind of character, and his attitude is, I think, what someone's attitude would be toward their mother if their mother was this sort of kooky spiritualist character,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, no, you're exactly right. That was the other aspect of Carswell's character that I really enjoyed, because he's when you get down to it, he is the quote unquote villain of the piece. But when it comes to the reactions that he has with his mother, he acts in a way that most viewers wouldn't think of a heavy would act, towards anybody, because there's a moment, especially, I'm getting to the point that I want to make here, there's a moment in the film where Carswell's mother actually calls Dr. Harrington's niece up to, it's the niece, yeah, that's right, she calls her up basically to warn her about what's going to happen, and that they have to do something. They need to get away. She's basically telling them, there's a way out, and I want you people to live. And Carswell basically catches her doing this.
Yeah.
And, I myself would think, okay, she's obviously dead. That's she's tried to aid the heroes. That's the last we see of her. But the way Carswell responds to her is exactly like you say. I understand what you just did, and I understand why you did it. I'm okay with it. I'm not very happy, but you know what? You're family, so I love you no matter what. He doesn't necessarily say that, but that's the way he responds to her when we're all expecting, him to basically slit her throat or something, cast her to hell, and he just handles her in a very, loving, familial way, and it just... That's one more thing that endears us more to him just as a person and a character.
That makes him... He's one of the more likable villains I think I've ever seen in a horror film, really.
Yeah, definitely. Because he doesn't act and... even at his most evil moments in the film, he never really acts completely cold, I think, to anybody.
Yeah.
He just lets everybody know, and not in an enraged way or a dramatic way, when he's explaining to Holden why he sent the demon after Harrington and why he's basically sending it after Holden now. He's just telling him, hey, I was trying to, practice my beliefs in peace, and I submitted them to you to get your approval, and you guys were kind of jerks about it. So hey, you're just you're being fed what you've dealt.
Right.
And
Right.
he's just so nonchalant about it, and he's not like rubbing his hands together in a Todd Slaughter type of way or anything
Right.
like that. He's just telling them that, hey, you just gotta pay for the way you've been acting. Maybe now you'll believe. It's almost like he's teaching them a lesson,
Hmm.
and just the most passive way possible, really.
Well, his manners are much better than Dr. Holden's manners.
Oh,
You
for
know,
sure. Dr.
uh,
Holton's an ass.
yeah, he thinks nothing of just openly insulting people. You
Yeah,
know,
it's really
and
sick.
Carswell is even polite to him. And Carswell hats him into his house
Oh
and
yeah.
has a perfectly civil conversation with him. You know, and Carswell at a certain point gives him a chance. I mean, he gives him a certain period of time before the curse will act itself out. And he could take the curse off him up to a certain point,
Yeah.
but Holden puts it off and puts it off and keeps dismissing him. And that's the reason, really, that the film ends the way that it does, because Holden refuses to believe what's happening for so long. He holds out for so long, and his ego just can't admit that he's wrong.
Yeah.
He
And
can't admit what's going on is real.
no,
And
that's exactly right. I mean, it's just incredible how how blind this guy can be. So it's almost edible how blind
yeah,
this guy is. So I wanted to ask you too, being that this film is based on an M.R. James story, are you particularly familiar with most of his work? Have you read a lot of it?
I've read his. He had a collection published called Ghost Stories of an Antiquary,
Yeah, yeah.
and I've read all of those stories. That was his most famous collection, and I basically I really like old horror fiction,
Oh, yeah, me
and
too.
I would much rather read somebody like him or Ambrose Bierce
Mm-hmm.
or Algernon Blackwood
Oh,
than I
yeah.
would some of the contemporary writers. I think that it's more often the writing is more concerned with storytelling
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I really appreciate, and it has a certain atmosphere just by virtue of the fact that it's old.
Yeah.
Um, James himself, every Christmas, he was a college provost, and every Christmas he would have a gathering at his house where he would perform his latest story for his students. And he was apparently really a good actor, too. He had done some acting, and so it was a real spellbinding kind of thing.
Oh, I'm sure.
And I think when you read his stories, you can still feel that. You feel like you're being told a story.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just something about that level of removal where you're sort of sitting back and the story's being presented to you that really appeals to me. It gives me a little bit of a sense of maybe sitting around a fire,
Yeah.
listening to somebody tell a really spellbinding story at night, while camping or whatever. And I don't get that often when stories are so contemporary
Mm-hmm.
that there's no level of removal at all. It's just the characters are all contemporary people and it's happening in your world. It loses a little bit of atmosphere. There's something about the quaintness of it and the oldness of it that appeals to me. I get an extra charge out of it because of that.
No, yeah,
Um,
same
yeah.
here. Yeah, I feel the exact same way about it. And there are certain benefits that you get with more contemporary fiction, whether it's horror or not. No, we're mostly talking about horror here, but you get the benefit of maybe being able to relate, obviously, a little bit better than you would in a story that takes place in the late 1800s. But like you say, there's just because that is a time that we have not lived in, we don't know what it's like, that gives it that certain, almost dreamlike quality to it.
Mhm.
So when we read those stories, whether they're newer stories that happen to take place in those times, or they're stories that were written during those times, it becomes a journey almost
Yeah.
because they're going to places that we've never been before, seeing the way places looked before, we ever saw them, and it just adds that extra level of fantasy to it, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. People, the counter argument might be, oh well, that makes it less realistic. Well, no, not essentially yes, but like I say, that's not necessarily a bad thing because when you have a landscape that is totally unknown to you, you can imagine it any way which way you want almost, and like I say, it just kind of takes on the status of a journey of sitting before that crackling fire filled with Yule logs and going to a place that is completely fresh and new to you. And when it's a horror story, particularly, you're convinced more so than you would be in, say, a contemporary piece that those things could happen because we're all jaded and we know that ghosts and cell phones can exist side by side, so to speak. But when we hear about a ghost haunting this old Victorian mansion that comes back every year on the anniversary of its murder, that's a much more potent, I think, story than, say, again, something from more contemporary times.
I think there's something about the distance that we have from it that makes it more plausible.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a hard time believing something's happening in our world.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're actually looking back into a world that's gone, a world that's kind of exotic just by virtue of being different from where we are, that can really charm you and suspend your disbelief in a way that maybe doesn't happen when you're reading something contemporary.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And to me, there is nothing more exquisite, and this is a particularly fanciful idea for me, especially because I live in Florida, so I don't even know what a white Christmas is. But there's nothing more delectable to me than just that image alone of being able to sit around the warmth of a fire during a cold winter's evening, reading ghost stories to each other. Just saying it gives me a charge, in your words. And it's just such a wonderful atmosphere, and it's the winter, and particularly when I think those stories are most effective. A good ghost story is effective all year round. I mean, just look at The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. That story basically takes place in the spring and could only happen in the spring, really. But when you tell ghost stories at Christmas or during the winter time, it just adds so much more to it because it's a to put it in kind of a crude way, it's a cold, wasted, dead landscape because it's cold as the grave, and it just gives you that chilly, magical feeling. And when the air is just charged with, such a sense of the supernatural, telling ghost stories just seems to be the most natural thing to do, I think, in an atmosphere like that.
Well, I love being able to associate horror with Christmas.
Oh yeah,
I love the fact that he was identified with the tradition of telling scary stories at Christmas time. Christmas, it's not my favorite thing. I'm one of those people who gets depressed at Christmas.
You're one of those
My favorite
losers.
holiday is Halloween. So it's a way of having certain elements of Halloween at Christmas.
So I take it you're a fan of Nightmare Before Christmas, maybe?
Yeah, I've always really, Christmas comes around and I always make a point of watching some Santa slasher films,
Well, no,
from that disgusting holiday cheer.
Well, no, it's like you say, it's to kind of make a kind of food metaphor out of it. You're combining, and this is a combination that a lot of people seem to like. It's like eating chocolate along with popcorn. You get the salty, slight bitterness of the autumn festivities that, deal with all these dark doings and, rituals, which, Christmas is kind of, sort of, but whatever. And you get the sweetness of the holidays. Everybody's just rosy-cheeked and happy to see you, and when you combine those two things, it makes for a really, delectable combination. Like you say, just having ghoulishness in the holiday season, it helps balance things out, I think. And for somebody to like that type of thing, I think is the sign of a healthy mind, in my opinion. But yeah, it's just a a wish of mine for sure would always, I would love to get the chance to, hear some ghost stories at Christmas. It's a great tradition, and I think people tend to forget, getting a little off topic here, but I think people tend to forget that A Christmas Carol is in essence people kind of, yeah, they subdue the ghost part of that, and oh no, it's a holiday classic. Well, it's kind of a horror story too when you
Yeah,
think about it, because there are dead people walking around. But
yeah, it's definitely a ghost story
yeah,
for sure.
yeah, and it's nice to kind of, you know to have that, a grinning jack-o'-lantern still around come Christmas time. It just helps to remind you that there's still hope. Not everything is sugar plums. There's still hope for some good old-fashioned spookiness.
Does the connection to Aleister Crowley intrigue you at all of the story?
Yeah, when you mentioned it, it was interesting. I mean, before I watched this film, I didn't even realize that the character was based on Aleister Crowley, and I know not a lot about the man himself, but I was intrigued to find that out. I mean, like you mentioned, I was, before I read into him, I was always under the impression, you know, that Crowley was more or less a Satanist, basically, that he kind of was, that he was associated with darker things than he really was in actuality. Of course, when you hear a Black Sabbath song, that really doesn't help.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I was very fascinated to find out that you say he was more of a Kabbalist, and
Hmm.
he was essentially into white magic, not dark magic.
Well, he believed that he started a religion called Thelema, which was a mixture of a whole lot of things. It was a mixture of the Kabbalah and the I Ching and Freemasonry, and he had been for a while in the Order of the Golden Dawn, which William Butler Yeats also belonged to, and Arthur Edward Waite, and a number of other really well-known people in England at that period of time. Crowley got kicked out of the Golden Dawn because he was apparently a fairly difficult personality. He had to run things. He was kind of a control freak, and he had a bit of rivalry with other people, including Yeats, who was obviously a much more influential figure in that group than Crowley was.
Right.
But Crowley believed that this religion of his, which is called Thelema, was dictated to him by his guardian angel. He called his guardian angel Iwas, and he wrote this book called the Book of the Law, which is the Bible of this new religion. But it has to do with Jewish mysticism, and he called the Kabbalah the Yoga of the West. And he was thinking of it more in terms of something that developed the mind. You were trying to become the highest possible self that you could be. And but he did a lot of things to get attention because of being something of a control freak. And I think a lot of the things in his public image, he was bisexual, for example.
Really?
And I would consider extremely scandalous. And he had a whole series of relationships with women who, after he was done with them, ended up in mental hospitals, which probably didn't help his image either.
I'm sure.
But he had notoriety. At one point, the press described him as the most evil man in England. But when you get right down to it, I don't really think he was evil. I think he was just eccentric,
Right.
And now, even though at this time he didn't really have any followers and was regarded as this big figure of scandal, now actually his religion is practiced all over the place. They have a big lodge, big Thelemic lodge, which is named after the poet William Blake in Baltimore.
Really?
Which is not terribly far from me.
Have you been to that?
No, I haven't. I'm friends with them on Facebook, and I'd like to go sometime, but I just haven't gotten around to it. You know, I'd be curious to see what actually goes on.
Yeah, I would say so. Well, that's definitely brings interesting light, I think, to the Carswell character. I don't think, well, of course, they took some liberties with that because it's made pretty clear in the film that Carswell is dealing with dark forces. The titular demon itself is evidence, more than enough evidence of that. But I think you can pick up on some similar characteristics from what you say Crowley had in the Carswell character, particularly his eccentricity. I think you can definitely tell that Carswell's a little bit of an eccentric nut.
And Carswell likes attention. In the movie, Carswell says that he doesn't want any attention, and he says that he and his followers just want to be left alone, which is different from the story because the story Carswell is based on Crowley, and Crowley thrived on attention. Crowley did all kinds of things to get press and would show up in public places dressed in his big black cloak and did a lot of things that were kind of theatrical.
Right.
So James's Carswell was a lot more like Crowley, I think, than the Carswell in the movie. The Carswell in the movie actually doesn't want publicity, and one of the things he's disturbed about is that this symposium that Holden's involved in will get a lot of press, and the idea of it is to discredit his beliefs, publicly discredit his beliefs, and that what he wants is just to be left alone, to pursue his eccentricity in private. So that's a big difference than Crowley. Crowley, I think, was meant to be the occultist pope or something,
Yeah, pretty
he
much.
never attracted the following in life that he wanted to. He was just regarded as this bizarre character.
Right. Do you think that's pretty much how James probably regarded him as well?
Yeah. James realized that he wanted attention. In the book, in the story, his character gets upset with Harrington and kills Harrington, sends the demon after Harrington because they won't read his paper at a similar kind of symposium that they're having, but the symposium is discussing them like alchemy. Right. And he wants them to read a paper that he's written on alchemy, and they reject it because they think that his writing's a mess and that he doesn't make very much sense. But he wants them to take him seriously as an expert on the occult. Mm-hmm. And in the film, Carswell wants to be left alone. So that's one area where it really diverges from James's story. James's Carswell wants attention, just like Crowley, and is trying to get attention. And when he doesn't get it, he's not happy.
It's not the attention he wants.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we definitely covered some fascinating ground, I think, and I basically wanted to wrap up, as I do in most of the episodes, by asking you directly, why did you choose Night of the Demon, or Curse of the Demon for some of those of you out there? Why did you choose this particular film to spotlight, and why does it mean so much to you?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I really like the story, and I really like storytelling, and the story is the foremost thing in this film. It does have a lot of atmosphere, and it does kind of mesmerize you when you see this creature coming out of another world and following you and becoming more and more tangible and getting closer and closer. But I think that all of the suspense comes from what's going on in the minds of the characters. Mm-hmm. And I like that. I really like the fact that it takes a while to cast its spell and it builds. And I like the psychological side of it. And I think that that's a lot more prevalent in the story than it is in film. But film, for all the ways that it diverges from the story, it really captures that atmosphere and that feeling of tension that builds through the whole story very, very well. And it's always haunted me. I saw it as a child, and it's never lost its power for me. It's always remained one of the spookiest films I've ever seen. And I can go back to it and watch it now, and it still raises the hair on my arms.
It definitely is creepy. And
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more with all the points that you made. It is a wonderful story. One of the most unique, as we said earlier, to come out of this decade in horror films, which, for that alone, it should be seen by fans of the genre out there. And of course, it is just perfect, virtually perfect, in building up the tension and the suspense that it does. And, for that, it's heartily recommended to all who haven't seen it, and it's even recommended to those who have. If you haven't watched it in some time, watch it again anyway, particularly during this time of the year, at around Christmas, I think would be most appropriate. Well, Jack, it's been awesome talking to you about this film. It is, a personal favorite of mine, and I think, like I say, that everybody should see this at least once. It's a wonderful, wonderful little picture, and I think it'll surprise people in just how taken they'll probably become with it.
Yeah, I think it's scarier actually than any modern horror film I can think of. Not that I don't love films. I love horror films even when they're bad,
Yeah.
But there really aren't too many that are as spellbinding and as haunting as this one. And thanks for giving me a chance to discuss it.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. And for all of you listening out there, you definitely stop by Jack's place, Lavender Lair of Horror. You're more likely to laugh than scream when you go there, but sometimes the best the best moments are had when we laugh at the things that scare us. And Jack is definitely the man to go for that type of thing. So thank you again for joining us for Sinister Spotlight. And sorry. And for all those of you still with us, thanks, by the way. And when you get the chance, definitely watch Night of the Demon from 1957. Just remember, it's in the trees. Good night.